Hello and welcome to another episode of Planet Outlook Dialogues. My guest today is Dr. Kartik Shanker, eminent marine scientist, ecologist from the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. Dr. Shankar is more just than a scientist, I would love to say. One is his love for sea turtles, but he wears many hats. Founder of several NGOs, founder editor of the current conservation magazine, author of the acclaimed Soup to Superstar book, and now writing and producing stories for children. Dr. Shankar, thank you so much for joining us on this show.
Thank you, Ananda.
Yeah. So, Kartik, I want to ask you by beginning, why turtles? What made you start working on turtles? I know you now call yourself a turtle tracker. So, how did it all begin?
Well, as they say, the story always begins before the story, right? And in the early 1970s, Romulus Whittaker and some of his friends started conducting these turtle walks on the Chennai coast, and he was already sort of doing crocodile surveys around the country, and king cobra surveys, and he had these really wonderful experiences all over. But along the Chennai coast itself, through Snake Park, which he just started, he was and volunteers and friends, he was he knew that there were olive ridleys nesting there, and so they do these turtle walks. And a group of them decided that they should have turtles whose eggs were being poached, so they would take them and put them, relocate them in a safe place. And the first year, the so-called hatchery was actually in the backyard of a friend's house. The friend turns out that the friend was a very well-known historian, Jean Delouche. And this became sort of like a program that he and subsequently the original turtle man of India, Satish Bhaskar, my mentor, was involved in. But a lot of local people, like the filmmaker Shekhar Dattatri, Anne Ahimaz, and Joseph, who then Tess and Ahimaz of WWF, and all of these people sort of pioneered this idea of citizens walking along the coast, protecting these turtle eggs. The late 70s and early 80s, this was done by the mid 80s. It was the hatcheries were maintained by the Forest Department, and WWF and other groups would conduct the walks for public and collect these eggs and put them in the hatcheries. Late 80s, for some reason, the Forest Department decides to close down its hatcheries. And in the meantime, students from colleges like Madras Christian College, where I was, would go on these turtle walks either with WWF or with one of the other NGOs. And so, my seniors and so on had been going on turtle walks. Some of them were, like coordinators of turtle walks and so on. And so when the Forest Department decided to close down its hatcheries, ostensibly, I think some forest officer said, we have released so many turtle hatchlings, the Bay of Bengal is full of turtle hatchlings, and we cannot release anymore. So on that basis,
sorry to.
This is all on.
Olive ridley.
Yeah, they're all on release. And so this one of my seniors and a few others come to me, and like we get together as a group, and they say, we've decided we'll start our own group called the Students Sea Turtle Conservation Network, and we'll set up our own hatchery, and we'll sort of manage it ourselves, and we get Forest Department permits. And I think about it like some 19, 20-year-olds starting on a project like this. They came to me today. I tell them, you're idiots. This is not possible, right? But we were idiots, and we thought, okay, chalo, karte hain. And we started this organization, and of course, we were all already going on turtle walks. And I started only the previous year, and I had walked, and I'd never seen a turtle laying eggs. I mean, we found some nests, but. So I remember, we started the students group, and 2 or 3 of us were out on our first turtle walk, and there was a full moon, and we, on the beach, suddenly you see a track, and then if you see two tracks, then it came and went away, right? And then you get really excited when you see only one track, because the turtle is still somewhere there. So we sort of slowly crawled up behind it along the track. Making sure that we weren't going to disturb the turtle, and then we found this turtle nesting and laying eggs, and we were able to sort of see this literally this prehistoric creature that spends most of its life at sea and just comes ashore so briefly, and you're seeing it in that moment, right? And somehow there was just something so captivating about that moment, so sort of like romantic about it. Uh, I think I was like hooked at that very moment. Um, and as I've talked to more and more people about how they got inspired to work on turtles, people in different walks of life and many well-known conservationists, many have a similar story about moonlit night, this creature that you never see the rest of its life, and it just appears and it's quite beguiling actually. And
But you
so
have
it was
tracked
it was
also.
the
Yeah.
romanticism of, sorry.
So,
Yeah,
you have also tracked a lot of other species of turtles, basically. So for
yeah,
the viewer who hasn't seen a sea turtle, so give us a sense on how just not olive ridleys, which I may say makes news once a year or twice a year
yeah,
makes
yeah,
news.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But there are also 7 or 8 species which come on the Indian coastline, which you have tracked
Yeah.
all your life. For 30 years you have been tracking. So just tell us about the other species also which comes and that you have tracked.
Sure.
Hmm.
So, yeah, as you said, the olive ridley sort of gets the most attention, at least sort of in Indian media. Uh, there are only 7 species of sea turtles in the world, and it's amazing how much attention they attract. You go for an international sea turtle conference, there are 1,000 people for 7 species of sea turtles. Not like 1,000 species of like birds or frogs or insects or whatever. And of the 7 species, 5 are globally distributed. The largest one, the leatherback, the green turtle, the hawksbill, the loggerhead, and the olive ridley. And these 5 species are actually all found in Indian waters, but only the olive ridley nests along much of the mainland coast. You get a little bit of green turtle nesting in Gujarat, and of course, you get nesting of green turtles and hawksbills in both the island groups. And then you get leatherback nesting predominantly in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. In fact, predominantly the Nicobar Island and to a certain extent the Andaman Islands. Other than these 5 species, the 2 others, there's the Australian flatback, which um, no surprises is found only in Australia, and the Kemp's ridley, which is found only on the coast of Mexico. Um, so, but we've done a lot of work on olive ridleys in Orissa. We've done work on green turtles in Lakshadweep, and we've done work on leatherback turtles in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. It's my work on leatherbacks also started with about 20 years ago with on Great Nicobar Island, um, where uh, today, sadly, there are plans for having these transshipment ports and so on at the very
Yeah,
beaches where
yeah. I was about to come to that because
yeah, we'll come back to that. But to answer your original question, over the last 10 years, we've tracked leatherback turtles from the Andamans, and these are these giant, um, turtles that grow to 7, 8 feet in length. They weigh 600, 700 kilograms, and we've only tracked about 10 turtles, and a majority of them went southeast towards, past Indonesia, past Sumatra, and Cocos Keeling Islands, and some of them even reached the west coast of Australia, which and to a point that we thought actually we know that okay, we know where these turtles go. And then the last 2 turtles that we tracked both went in the opposite direction, and one went to Mozambique and one went to Madagascar. So the leatherback turtles from the Andamans seem to be tracking the entire Indian Ocean, which is pretty cool.
well, that's fascinating kind of thing. So which was the longest? The one going towards Africa?
Yeah, I think the longest track was the one that ended up on the coast of Mozambique.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now let me come back. We have this amazing long coastline, which is not much talked about, 7,000 plus.
Mhm.
And obviously, for the last 30 years, lots has changed, kind of thing. Even as you mentioned in the Andaman and Nicobar, things are kind of moving pretty fast. The beaches that you have walked all your life are not the same beaches right now, kind of thing. So, just tell us about how things have changed and how it is affecting turtles or marine life, because all of our wildlife talk, conservation talk is centered around terrestrial animals. It's tiger, also rhino, leopards. But having such a some 7,000 plus coastline, are we kind of, or correct me if I'm wrong, that we somewhere we are not very focused on kind of marine conservation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think apart from like, turtles, to a large extent, we have not paid much attention to marine conservation in the last, 50 years since the Wildlife Act was passed. Even though a lot of, all sea turtle species and so on, and more recently some sharks have been added to the, to Schedule 1. Regardless, marine conservation has not been a focus. There's relatively few numbers of, marine protected areas. We actually have a pretty good idea of the coast, thanks, to my mentor Satish Bhaskar, who I mentioned, who actually pretty much walked along the entire coast of India, mapping turtle nesting beaches. So in that sense, we have, from his surveys in the 70s and 80s to more recent surveys by various organizations around the country, some of which was coordinated by the Wildlife Institute of India. When my mentor BC Chowdhury and I were working there together. I was his postdoc, and we coordinated other series of surveys around the country. And since then, we've been also like working with NGOs that like work in different states. So we have a pretty good idea of the history of nesting, as well as the state of those beaches. Now, to be honest, at this point in time, nesting still continues to occur in many of the places where it occurred before. Uh, in fact, if anything, I would say that nesting has, in places like Orissa from the 80s and 90s, when there was probably a lot of like mortality due to trawlers and fishing, that in beaches like Rushikulia and Orissa, olive ridley nesting has probably like increased in the last 15 years. Not probably, in Rushikulia it has increased from, you know, 25 to 50,000 turtles nesting in one Aribada or mass nesting event. We now routinely document 150 to 200,000 turtles and sometimes over 300,000 turtles. So I don't want to paint the picture that across the board nesting has declined across all these sites. There are some specific places where nesting may have declined, but there are a large number of places where nesting has remained stable or even increased. Now, the reason I'm sort of emphasizing that is that the threat that has been perhaps given the most attention is direct mortality related threats like poaching of eggs, of course, which has mostly declined, but then killing of adult turtles, and most recently incidental mortality in fishing nets, right? However, we do feel like while that can be a problem, these populations have the ability to recover from those threats. What has been more sort of like, I would say, insidious, and what has been growing more slowly, and of course now in the last 10 years growing more rapidly, is coastal development, right? And coastal development has the potential to lead to habitat loss that completely destroys nesting beaches. So the kind of extent of, there are ports and harbors which have already caused a lot of erosion, but there are still sandy beaches left, right? But if that sort of coastal development in terms of ports and harbors, in terms of coastal industry, resorts, and all that continues without any accommodation of maintaining the resilience and the sanctity of those coastal, sandy beaches and those habitats, and if they lose their nesting beaches, then truly those populations are in danger. And we haven't arrived at that point yet, but we're at the cusp of that point. So I do appreciate when people said, 10,000 turtles are dying each year because of fishing. It's a big problem. We need to resolve it. This is actually a much bigger problem that could, where we might not have turtles 50 years from now because all the beaches are gone, right? So that is what I fear. And the development model is, which sort of seems to be on track. And there are sort of sensitive areas like, island areas where these, the mainland, even if you build a port or you build a resort or something, at least maybe 10 kilometers away, there is another beach where the turtle can go. Whereas in those places, if that beach gets destroyed, the last nesting sort of opportunity for that population may have been taken away with it. And then we don't know how they'll respond to that. So I would say that the coast has become more and more developed. Fishing has become more and more mechanized. All of these have posed threats, but more than the threats in the past is the threats of the future that truly concern me.
Recently, Kartik, a lot of the plastic pollution in the oceans have made headlines, kind of thing, which is affecting marine life, including turtles. What are the trends that you have noticed in Indian waters? Is it a big problem?
We don't have enough studies of this. I've been involved in a couple of preliminary studies that researchers associated with me carried out, both on seawater and then another one on beach sand. And certainly the study on beach sand, I mean, like we're detecting large traces of microplastics. Uh, but I would say that, we really have to do those studies of, sand and water and marine organisms as well. I mean, we need to carry out those studies to look at the extent of microplastic pollution in our waters, which I would suspect are very, very high, because the at least the narrative in the West is like some very large proportion of microplastics in the ocean comes from Asia, and from China and India and so on, and that's what you know the studies are apparently showing, and I wouldn't be terribly surprised by it. Um, I think it's a genuine concern. Uh, I do think, however, that it's one of those environmental concerns that's a bit also that's newsworthy. I'm not saying it's not I'm not at all saying it's not a concern, but in the sense that we like to identify these, like, sort of, these targets in a sense. Uh, we should address it, but at the same time, I think that the that um, terrestrial or marine, are really incorporate both biodiversity as well as human well-being. And many of these, like, environmental campaigns that we embark on, uh, sort of, whether it's about protection of a particular species or let's solve the marine plastics problem, it doesn't solve the larger human environment relationship problem. It doesn't sort of ask the questions of who's bearing the cost of all these, like, environmental safeguards that we're putting in. And I don't mind, placing demands on rich companies, for sure, but very often most of the things we do in conservation have a disproportionate cost to the economically weaker, to the more marginalized communities. So I hate answering like I hate giving a straightforward answer to a conservation question, because I feel like then we're like looking at one, six blind men and an elephant kind of situation. Like, we have to look at this whole situation holistically in terms of what are the actions that we can take that will result in an optimal combination of, healthy ecosystems, protecting the iconic marine species that might be keystones in those systems, and also protecting and safeguarding the well-being of the humans and communities that are dependent on them. So
you are optimistic. You sound optimistic.
Optimistic about global developmental trajectories, right? I mean, it's something that seems to have been like on a, it's a locomotive train moving in one direction. It's the freight train, right? And so one often asks oneself, we're not going to go back to Gandhian lifestyles. I mean, I think we're not suggesting that one does, and we're not, that's not the expectation. But how do we modify our approach to environment, and in a way that is feasible for the large majority of people, but in the same way that there is greater equity. And so people ask me, why do how does democracy come in? Why did you say democracy in the middle of all this, right? But I think that, like, that resilient, healthy societies, for which you need greater equity, greater democracy, greater transparency, greater accountability, all these things that also, Ananda, you as a journalist are used to talking about in a political sphere. I think those values are equally important in environmental conservation. And I think that by environmental conservationists, by ignoring that, have actually done a disservice to themselves and the environment, right? So if you ask me, where do you start with conservation or marine conservation, I say with people. Let's start with healthy society, healthy, empowered fishing communities.
Yes,
And that I'm optimistic about.
yeah,
That I'm optimistic about.
yeah, because you are also mentored a lot of young people, an entire generation, to come into the marine field. You have co-founded a wonderful magazine. Yeah, I feel the current conservation magazine, though it's not a very commercial thing, it's one of the most fabulous magazines that I get to read.
Thank you.
And also NGOs where a lot of young people are working that you have co-founded. So how do you manage all this?
Good people and delegation. So as far as NGOs are concerned, the primary one that I'm associated with is Dakshin Foundation, which, um, again, our mission is both environmental and social justice. want to achieve sustainability, but with a balance between environment and society. And most of our work is in coastal and marine communities. And the reason that it works is that, as a group of trustees, the four of us who started it have all invested, time and, my, effort into it. But my fellow trustees, have basically worked for the organization full time, and so people have invested their lives into it. And we have a fabulous group of youngsters, people who came to join us out of their masters 10 years ago and have now grown into senior positions. I want to emphasize that because, I think traditionally in Indian society, whether it's like, companies that I don't have to name them, right? Or like academia, it's, till you're 80 or you're 90, you want to run the show, right? And you just don't encourage young people to actually take leadership positions. And I think we truly wanted to do that, and it's paid off because those young people are now the leaders of the organization. My the two young researchers who've run my turtle programs in Orissa and the Andamans, Murli and Adit. My two researchers, Murli and Adit, Muralidharan and Adit Swaminathan, who've run the programs in Orissa and Andamans respectively for the last 10 years. I've recently, told them that I'm handing over the reins to all of my turtle work to the two of them at the end of this year. Uh, because I truly believe that you need that youth and enthusiasm, and to take the reins of the leadership and take it in directions that us as more experienced, but also like tired in some ways minds will not think of, right? So that's something that we wanted to encourage at Dakshin.
And what motivated you to start something like current conservation?
Well, current conservation was absolutely. I mean, it's a sort of different trip entirely. I think we wanted to produce a magazine that was more about connecting to the public. I mean, I was the editor of a journal called Conservation and Society, and I read in the original mission of the magazine that we want to reach managers and public and all that. And I found that after 4 or 5 years I was editing the magazine, it had become a very serious social science journal that is today globally very well respected. It's one of the highest ranked conservation social science journals. But 12 years ago, I looked at that and I said, no manager or layperson is reading this. So one of those original aims, I said, we wanted to produce a world-class journal. We're doing that, but we're not doing this other part. So we started thinking about current conservation as a sister publication to Conservation Society, which would communicate these ideas to the larger public. But pretty soon it sort of just became this little independent, got a life of its own, and it became this little independent vehicle. And again, one of my early co-editors had this idea of bringing on board artists and illustrators, and that's what I mean about bringing other people on board. It was not an idea that crossed my mind, and so when Nandini said, let's bring on board some illustrators and get our articles illustrated, I was like, yeah, why not? That sounds like an interesting idea. I didn't know it would work. But we've become this platform for this meeting of art and science. Just last month, I mean, as you know, Ananda, we have now a partnership with the Society for Conservation Biology, which is this international society, and it's because they produce academic journals, and they want to have a vehicle to connect to the general public, and they see this combination of art and science, which would this platform that we're providing for people to come together to tell stories, as being really sort of unique and valuable. So I don't take credit for it in the sense that I planned it this way. But ideas came from different places, and they've really blossomed in a way that that we're all, you included, we're all really proud of now.
And now your foray into children's book. I know you're a very prolific writer. That Soup to Superstar was a big hit. But now you're more and more focusing on children's literature, which is quite interesting. So tell us a bit on that.
I think again there was a bit of a serendipitous story. When I was at ATRI many years ago, Rohini Nilakini was has been a very long supporter of A-Tree, and she was then also involved with Pratham Books. And so she heard a talk that I gave, and she said, and she just sort of said, like, I'm working with Pratham Books. I'm going to connect you with somebody because I think you should write a children's story about turtles, and I think it will be very nice. And she put me in touch with this fantastic illustrator, Maya Ramaswamy, and so it was just that like very casual sort of like throwaway statement that resulted in the first one, which was Turtle Story, right? And and once that happened, there are things which are an addiction. For me, learning to dive was an addiction, and I was like, I got into marine biology because I was like, wow, this is an amazing thing. And then I started writing these stories, which I really enjoyed. Always done some writing, and and then to get somebody to come in and illustrate it, and just like you get this product that's so spectacular. I hadn't arrived at that point with current conservation yet, right? So that was my first experience of writing something and having this beautiful product at the end of it. And I was like, wow, I want to do that again. And I mean, we didn't mention it today, but like, as you know, I mean, with my students, I work on frogs and birds and snakes and lizards and a whole bunch of other terrestrial taxa. And so then, I was like, all these interesting stories that I have from my own research, from my students and so on, I was like, I can make these nice children's stories around these. And so people ask me if it's to convey a message. It really is not. I mean, in a sense, it's to convey my wonderment about the ecology and natural history and, the natural world. Um, but other than that is the pleasure of writing for that audience and the pleasure of having somebody take your work and just come up with something that looks so beautiful. And the most recent picture book was a book about a little girl in the Lakshadweep called Moonlight in the Sea that I did with Prabha Malia. And again, it's just like, I have some picture in my head when I write, that one paragraph or a particular panel, but the picture that the artist produces is so dramatically different from what I imagined in my not very creative, visually creative head, right? And the sheer pleasure of seeing what comes from them, it's teaching me something new about it as well. So in a way, just that experience itself is an absolute pleasure, and it's addictive, and that's why I do it. And I'm glad, if people enjoy it, that's a bonus.
One last quick question before we end this is your message. A lot of youngsters who are watching this show and are looking at the marine world maybe differently after hearing stories from you. So what's your kind of 2-3 words for them?
Well, I think I'm going to use the word, diversity and pluralism to sort of hang my coat on, because I'm obsessed with turtles. 30 years I've been obsessed with turtles, but I keep saying that like with tigers and with pandas or elephants, what happens to conservationists and especially people that are like grew up in cities and all that, we tend to miss the forest for the trees. We tend to get hooked onto that particular symbol rather than the bigger picture. So turtles are beside the point. The point is the coastal and marine ecosystem. The point is this diversity of habitats and oceanic habitats, coral reefs, seagrass beds, sandy beaches. That's what we're trying to protect, along with all the organisms in it. That diversity also applies to culture. So, the people that live along with those animals in forests or on coasts, and the way they utilize them, whether they choose to, conserve them, whether they choose to eat them, I think we have to be willing to, accommodate, diversity in all of our interactions with nature and with people, and losing that diversity and losing that ability to have this pluralism of the ways we interact, we're really diminishing ourselves. So I'd like to leave young people with that, and the other thing, the other thing that I think many of us like oldies will, we heard to say is that everybody can do something, right? I'm the 100th person to make that statement, but it's a cliche well worth repeating. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kartik Shankar. Pleasure having you always, and hope to see you later this year after this COVID thing gets over. It's been a long time. I haven't come down to Bangalore, haven't chatted with you, but thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Ananda. Look forward to meeting again very soon.